So whenever you're ready, Todd.
Thanks, Katie. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Safety Included, the workplace health and safety webinar series brought to you by Encompass Michigan, the statewide network of comprehensive human service providers working together to develop independence and achieve inclusive communities. Our topic today is Lockout Tagout. My name is Todd Culver. I'm the president and CEO of Encompass Michigan, and I'll be joined by our education coordinator, Kinde, who will introduce herself in a moment. This material was prepared under a Consultation Education and Training, or CET grant, awarded by the Michigan Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or MIOSHA. Encompass Michigan has a long-standing and valued partnership with MIOSHA, which is a part of the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, or LEO. We very much appreciate that partnership and their support. A little bit about us before we begin. My overall responsibilities with the association include leadership in program development, strategic planning and implementation of those initiatives, as well as financial plans, always in alignment with the purpose, vision, and values of Encompass Michigan. It's been my privilege really to be with the association since 1995. I started as a project director and then also served as assistant director prior to my service as CEO. As project director, where I began with the association, I did lead a technical assistance and training project that was funded through a CET grant that later expanded into loss prevention service for our self-insured group workers' compensation fund. So a heavy focus early on in my tenure with the organization, Occupational Health and Safety for member organizations. And prior to coming to Encompass Michigan, I also worked in the manufacturing sector for a tier one automotive supplier. And my plant management responsibilities did include environmental health and safety compliance. So returning to some extent to my roots in this field, and very happy to be with you today to present. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Todd. Hello. I am a 35-year-old autistic self-advocate. My name's Katie Kinde, who loves to learn and help others learn. I graduated with a master's in education with a focus in learning design in 2021 from Wayne State. I currently work for Encompass as an education coordinator. I create trainings, I coordinate events, I handle certificate distribution. I've done multiple leadership programs. I became a co-leader for the Michigan Advocates to End Seclusion and Restraint, but I'm now on their board. In my spare time, I love playing video games with my husband. I walk my Yorkie, and I like doing a lot of crafty things like making jewelry, drawing, gardening, and creating miniature houses.
Thanks, Katie. And a note about the content and its development. Inclusivity, as I hope you know, is very important to us at Encompass Michigan. This presentation was made with all needs in mind, and we try to avoid using too many colors or pictures. And when we do, try to describe them for users with low vision. Handouts are available on a shared drive. The link has been posted in the chat and I believe was distributed prior to the webinar today. We base the content of all safety included presentations on OSHA's recommended practices for safety and health programs, which present a really step-by-step approach to implementing those programs built around 7 core elements. And the main goal of safety and health programs is to prevent workplace injuries and illnesses. That's the spirit and intent of our project. It's in alignment with these core elements that have been established by OSHA. It's important to remember that this preventive approach is designed to circumvent the suffering and financial hardship that injuries and illnesses can cause for workers and their families, as well as the businesses that employ them. So these recommended practices use a proactive approach. That's the key to our approach to health and safety at Encompass, Michigan. Traditional approaches, conversely, are often reactive. Problems are addressed only after a worker is injured or becomes ill, or if a new standard or regulation is published, or perhaps an outside inspection is conducted that finds a problem that needs to be addressed. So these recommended practices recognize that finding and fixing hazards before they cause injury or illness is a far more effective approach. In plain language, that philosophy is summarized as there's always something about an incident that led to an injury that could have been different. In other words, accidents don't just happen in our view, and it's therefore incumbent on all of us to continuously assess the landscape to identify the potential for a problem and fix it before one occurs. So that's what this presentation is all about, providing a framework for effective safety programs that promote prevention, and in this particular instance, through the lens of the control of hazardous energy sources, or lockout tagout. We'll try to include clear, structured visuals and graphics that support comprehension. Katie will address a lot of this later in the session today. We're minimizing sensory distractions for both virtual and in-person settings. She'll discuss options for verbal and nonverbal participation, as well as interactive components that can promote greater engagement without overwhelming participants, and also consideration given to time buffered schedules that can allow for processing and reflection at the pace of the learner. It's our contention, supported by both MIOSHA and OSHA, that a safe workplace is sound business, and that's for everybody, regardless of neurotype. And that's also central to the content developed through this project, is that we can be inclusive of all learners, irrespective of neurotype, with all health and safety training. Specific to the compliance portion of today's session with Lockout Tagout, our training objectives include a review of the relevant MIOSHA standard. We'll talk about what the responsibilities are for an employer that are outlined in that standard, including when lockout is required. We'll provide you with some statistics that are compiled by federal OSHA that demonstrate the severity of injuries that can result when these procedures aren't followed, as well as outlining some of the sources of energy that should be considered, and a walkthrough of the basic steps of a lockout procedure. We'll also talk about accommodations, including employee training considerations for employers. That's the sort of two-part approach to the content of Safety Included, is that we'll cover a different compliance issue with every presentation, but also accommodations and considerations for employee training, in this instance, including building trust, addressing sensory overload or sensitivities, verbal and nonverbal learners, and communication styles, clear signs that can be supportive of effective learning, emergency procedures, and establishment of the concept of a safety buddy and implementing that practice, proprioception, which Katie will discuss later in the program, as well as time buffered schedules that I mentioned earlier, and the impact of the location of the training, depending on the learning style of those who are participating. And we'll also make sure that you have access to be able to use Safety Included resources moving forward. Relative to the MIOSHA standard, locking out machinery and equipment prior to servicing or maintenance is an essential element of protecting employees from the unexpected energization or motion or startup of a machine or a piece of equipment, or the release of energy that can be stored in that equipment. And an employer, therefore, is responsible for ensuring the safety of its employees and for complying with all related requirements of the MIOSHA standard, which is Part 85, the control of hazardous energy sources. The responsibilities outlined in that standard for employers are a requirement to plan for the control of energy during service or maintenance of machines and equipment by doing the following. So first and foremost is to establish an energy control program. There needs to be a written policy and procedure relative to lockout tagout. Specific procedures need to be developed, documented, and utilized for lockout tagout, specific to each piece of equipment where they need to be utilized. Employees need to be provided with appropriate training on their use, and employees also need to be provided at no cost the equipment required by those lockout procedures. And an employer is responsible for the continuing competency of those employees, both authorized and affected, through the training process. In plain terms, some examples of maintenance operations or other service projects during which the potential release of hazardous energy and therefore injury is the greatest can be categorized basically in two buckets. The first is anytime a guard or other safety device on a piece of equipment needs to be removed or bypassed to conduct that service or maintenance, lockout is definitely required. And the second is when an employee needs to place any part of their body in an area where it could be caught by machinery and the moving parts of that machinery, lockout definitely needs to be utilized in that instance. Some statistics from federal OSHA present that nationwide compliance with the lockout tagout standard prevents an estimated 120 fatalities and 50,000 injuries each year. And that workers on the job, or injured on the job, excuse me, from exposure to hazardous energy lose an average of 24 work days for recuperation. So these are just two data points. There's lots of information available to demonstrate that the importance of these procedures, because of the fact that the injuries that can result if they're not followed properly can be very, very serious. A few definitions from the MIOSHA standard, two of which apply to employees. The first is an authorized employee, and that is the individual who's doing the service or maintenance. It's one who locks out machines or equipment to perform that service or maintenance. And the second category of employee is referred to as affected employee. And basically that's everyone else, particularly anyone else working in the vicinity of that equipment. In specific terms, one whose job requires them to operate or use machine or equipment in an area where work is being done under lockout. So authorized are the folks that are doing the maintenance and therefore implementing the lockout procedures. Affected employees are usually machine operators or anyone working in the vicinity that needs to be aware of what's happening to stay safe. The next definition is energy isolating device. There are two examples of these on the screen. It's defined as a mechanical device that physically prevents the transmission or release of energy. Some examples of this include a disconnect switch, which is the upper image that's depicted to the right of the slide on the screen. A line valve, which is the lower image on the right-hand side of the screen. Can also include a manually operated electric circuit breaker or really any similar device that blocks or isolates energy. Devices that are not energy isolating but do control the activation of equipment are push buttons, selector switches. There are images of these two types of devices. Again, on the screen to the right, the upper image is a push button, the lower image a selector switch, and any other control circuit type devices. These are not energy isolating devices. So simply because a piece of equipment is turned off does not mean that the hazardous energy has been controlled. The potential sources of hazardous energy include electrical, pneumatic, water, natural gas, chemical or coolant, hydraulic, steam, mechanical, and gravitational. Electricity is certainly the most prevalent in a manufacturing environment, but there are often multiple energy or power sources connected to equipment that need to be considered when lockout procedures are developed and utilized. There is an image on the screen now that depicts some pictograms, some images portraying the different types of energy sources. Again, electrical, water, chemical, steam on the left, and pneumatic, natural gas, hydraulic, and mechanical on the right. Very helpful resource that's provided by MIOSHA in an appendix to their compliance materials. This was included in the documents that are linked in the chat box and that were distributed prior to the training. Is an example of a procedure that includes energy source evaluation and control. On that form in the appendix to the MIOSHA resource, there's space to complete the date and procedure number and who's conducting the lockout procedure. The equipment can be named there. But most importantly, there are a series of 5 columns on this particular page of the procedure template that include the energy source and magnitude. In this instance, electrical, pneumatic, flywheel or mechanical, and gravity are all identified, as well as the magnitude of those energy sources, the extent to which they are powering the equipment. The next column, moving to the right, is the means of isolation with electricity that happens to be the main electric panel, with the pneumatic pressure that happens to be a lockable air dump valve, and so forth. The next column outlines the location of the isolation device. So this is very important to the equipment-specific nature of these procedures, is that it becomes very, very easy to locate each isolation device for each power source based on what's documented on this form for the procedures. And then the procedure itself begins. And we'll go through this again in a moment, but step one is to first of all notify affected employees. In this instance, that means operators and a material handler and foreman that would be in the near vicinity. And the second step outlines the stopping procedures for shutting down the equipment, identifying the selector switch to turn it off, the how to turn off the air supply, and then moving through each of those energy sources accordingly. That is a sample lockout procedure that comes from MIOSHA. Those columns, again, identify the energy source, the way you isolate it, where it's located, how you notify employees, and the next step being how to shut it down properly. And what we have here is the next step, again by energy source. So that left-hand column remains the same for those 4 energy sources, but the next steps include isolating the energy source and applying the lock or tag. With the electrical, that's moving the disconnect switch to off. And with the pneumatic pressure, there's a very specific equipment-specific description of how to isolate and apply the lock. The next step, or step 4, is to block or relieve residual energy. That doesn't apply to all energy sources, but in this case, it does apply to the pneumatic and gravitational sources of energy, and there's a description there. Then that de-energization needs to be verified. We need to make sure that the equipment cannot actuate or operate once it's been locked out. And then step 6 are some procedures to take for releasing from lockout tagout. So again, this identifies the energy source. In this particular section of the template, it tells how to isolate it, how to apply the lock, how to consider and block any stored energy, and very, very importantly, how to verify that the equipment is actually locked out. So again, in review for a lockout, the basic steps of a lockout procedure, the first is to notify any employees that are affected by that procedure. The next is to review the written lockout procedure. And we've just gone through a basic template that's provided by MIOSHA for documenting those procedures. We identify all energy sources, and then we shut down the equipment. Next is to disconnect the power source or power sources, then isolate the energy, physically lock out and tag out the equipment, neutralize any stored energy, and that's especially true of air, hydraulics, and also gravitational. And then we test the equipment. We physically try to make it operate or actuate to make sure that it doesn't, once the energy sources have been disconnected and controlled. Once then that's been verified, the service or maintenance can be completed safely. But before restarting the equipment, once the service project is complete, everything should be double checked. including a few key reminders to make sure the equipment is in proper operating condition, that guards that have been removed need to be replaced, that any tools utilized for the maintenance project have been removed, and any braces or blocks utilized to isolate stored energy have also been taken away. Then all pressure tubing or hoses, if there were pneumatics or hydraulics involved, need to be reconnected and the valves placed in the correct position. And then verification that the work area is clear and that all affected workers, in fact, all workers, are safely positioned. And lastly, to make sure that all employees are wearing the appropriate personal protective equipment before the equipment begins operating again, and that all tags and locks have been removed by the authorized employee or employees. A few key tips to remember. First of all, after service or maintenance, again, be sure that any guards that have been taken off or bypassed are replaced before the machine is restarted. There are instances where multiple locks can be required to safely lock out a piece of equipment if it's large and requires multiple personnel to perform a service project. Never share a lock or a key. Each authorized employee should have their own. And we need to be specific. Written lockout procedures need to be specific to the piece of equipment. So not a generic procedure that covers all equipment, but one that names, locates specifically energy sources, and also details how those energy sources are controlled and locked out. And to that point of never sharing locks and keys, it can be the case that multiple authorized employees are involved in service or maintenance, and therefore multiple locks need to be used. And this can be accommodated, and that's usually through a device that's referred to as a daisy chain. And an image of that is depicted on the screen now on the right side of this slide. It's also important to remember that even in instances where a piece of equipment has a single energy source, namely electricity, and the only means of connecting the piece of equipment to that energy source are a cord and plug, there can be an exemption utilized to the lockout procedure. We encourage folks not to do that, but instead to implement a specific procedure for cord and plug connected equipment that utilizes a cap for the plug. There are two images of those types of devices depicted on the screen, one cylindrical and one more rectangular. And this physically prevents the potential for having that sole energy source reconnected during service or maintenance. And it's also important for the personnel performing the service project to have that plug under their exclusive control. And a couple more things to cover about compliance for the standard. There is a periodic inspection requirement as well, which means the procedures need to be checked at least annually. The lockout procedure needs to be reviewed with all authorized employees, and records should be kept that identify the machine or equipment that was reviewed, the date that the periodic inspection was conducted, and the employee both performing the inspection and those authorized employees that were included in the inspection. Sometimes retraining is required if there's a change in the job assignment, if there's a change in the machine itself or the process, and especially if that change results in modifications to the lockout procedure. And anytime any inadequacy is revealed during that periodic inspection or review process that I just outlined, that's when retraining needs to take place. And that covers the compliance portion of our presentation today. I'm going to turn it over to Katie to discuss some accommodations and training considerations.
Thanks, Todd. So I have two sections to go over, and this first one is the accommodations. So the following is meant to teach employers about accommodations for better outcomes for all employees of all neurotypes. In this case, for lockout and tagout. So some things to consider. There can be environmental aids that you can use. such as like methods that place important items such as keys and badges in a designated consistent location, or using color-coded files and folders. Keeping a tidy and low distraction workplace can help with this. Also consider an electronic key management system for that, for managing keys. You can also use memory aids such as mnemonic devices, acronyms, and checklists that aid recall. Wristlets can be very useful to be able to hold a key and not prevent loss of that key. The looped fabric wristlets or keychain fobs for convenient are convenient as well, and help with hands-free carrying. ID cards and holders are very nice, especially if they have a pouch to hold the keys alongside an RFID or a radio frequency identification card or ID badge. A key holder with a retractable cord can be very useful as well. Key cabinets and lock boxes also are very useful. They can use secure wall-mounted or electronic cabinets that have indexed hooks to store keys centrally. There are also intelligent systems out there that implement smart key technology. That it's an electronic system that requires access pins, fobs, or biometric scans to release those keys. Also, implementing a tagging system can be really important. So using not only clearly labeled and numbered tags for every lock, but also making sure they're durable so they don't wear over time. And overall ensuring that they are easily identifiable. This next section is a little longer, but it's how to train effectively. So each person, regardless of neurotype, has a preferred learning method, and the following is meant to help employers improve training methods for better outcomes. So employees of different neurotypes may have different needs to consider. Talking to employees directly about their preferences is the best way to ensure learning needs are met. So gain that trust by asking for consent to ask neurodivergent employees ways on improving your trainings. Also create a trusting relationship so that in times of stress or injury, employees can go to employers without fear. So neurodiverse employees have a lot of anxiety, so it's best to be patient and speak concise and in a neutral tone. Some employees may need additional support and freedom to ask questions to better understand. It is important to forge this trust early on. In other words, treat questions with respect so that employees do not fear being ridiculed in the future. This is an example of a conversation that may happen during a training between a manager and an employee. So the employee may ask, "Is this the only key cabinet?" The manager says yes. Um, the employee may ask, "If I get my own key, can I paint it a different color?" And the manager may say, "No, but we can see about getting a colored tag or accessory to put on your key." Um, the employee asks, "What if the key breaks while I'm using it? That happened to me once at home." The employer says, or the manager says, "That hasn't happened before, but let's come up with a plan just in case." So, back to that slide before, it's just really important to take consideration of the questions that are being asked, even if you don't know the answers, because it helps people who are neurodivergent process that information and help them learn better. And now to this side, universal design methods. These allow creators and learners to set clear goals, anticipate environmental barriers, create meaningful options, and fully embrace human variability. So having multiple methods to learn safety ensures that everyone has the resources they need to learn processes, regardless of neurotype. So consider making step-by-step documents, signs, videos, and plan on showing processes in person. This way, everyone can have multiple options to learn the same information. Sensory overload. This is a state where the brain receives too much sensory input to process, leading to symptoms like anxiety, irritability, confusion, and physical discomfort. It can be triggered by common stimuli such as loud noises, bright lights, strong smells, and crowded spaces, but also by emotional stress, physical fatigue, or environmental changes. So during sensory overload, information is less likely to be retained, and this leads to an unsuccessful training. So recognizing these triggers and using strategies like reducing exposure to stimuli, using sensory age, or finding quiet spaces can help manage this. So consider ways to ensure neurodiverse people are comfortable when training to ensure information is more easily retained. So consider sensitivities, especially when it comes to employees with autism. They may be extra sensitive to loud noises or bright lights, as well as other senses. Um, so converse and ask if any changes to the environment could help their learning experience and prevent sensory overload. While some of these can help during training, it may not be appropriate while equipment is operating. Some items that can be offered: white noise machines or access to white noise music online. There's a lot of free channels on like YouTube and things like that that provide white noise, tinted glasses, and headphones. Um, Also, for considerations that are auditory and visual for your trainings, ensure that your trainings are accessible. Neurodiverse people are prone to comorbidities, so visually, you should have large text to describe images or steps for anyone with low vision. When speaking, ensure that you are using a microphone if any employees have low hearing. Um, there's also a document about this in the link that I provided earlier. Consider sensitivities to sense. So those who are sensitive to sense, some smells may be overwhelming, especially from machinery. There are ways to manage these scents personally and environmentally. So for personal management, using masking techniques such as dabbing Vicks Vapor Rub, lavender, peppermint oil, or even toothpaste under a nose or inside a mask can help prevent certain scents from reaching into a mask or into somebody's nose. Um, Breathing through your mouth or taking shallow breaths or even humming can help block smells. Minty gum or strong mints or Listerine strips can also help. Also, make sure as an employee wearing clean uniforms and socks daily to avoid carrying odors, or just asking an employer to step away for fresh air if you're overwhelmed. For environmental management or for the employer, um, make sure that you're identifying the source of any smells and making sure if it's a cleanliness problem, make sure that you're cleaning all surfaces. Enzymatic cleaners are very good for this. Also ensure that there's proper air circulation. So using fans or opening windows when possible is key to ensuring that any lingering smells don't linger for long. Also consider some tactile sensitivities. So if your workers are wearing gloves, make sure that they aren't experience some discomfort from the material that they're wearing. Hyperallergenic options should always be considered as well. This is an important one. Considering proximity and comfort and consent for the proximity. Um, this is something that should be discussed even for just for everyday interactions beyond trainings. Because even as something as simple as placing a hand on an employee's shoulder may be extremely uncomfortable to a neurodivergent employee. So you should always be asking for consent when you're approaching somebody up close or trying to place your hands on them. For example, during an interactive in-person training on how to go through lockout tagout procedure, the trainer might want to show an employee up close. So trainers should ask if it's all right to be up close before showing each step. Also, let the employee learn by going through the steps themselves. Consider some employees may prefer verbal or nonverbal communication. So nonverbal just to try to describe what it is, it's not just about not talking, it's about using diverse communication methods, such as gestures and visuals, that are beyond speech, facing sensory challenges, and processing language differently, like literally or not nuanced. Sometimes certain neurotypes need to go nonverbal or shut down due to overwhelm, requiring patience and clear, direct communication, respecting their cues, and understanding their unique sensory processing needs to bridge the gaps. Communication before a shutdown is essential for preparing for these moments. Though not required, some employees may even prefer having signs on their name badge that show their current availability verbally. Color coding can be helpful, such as like maybe a green like magnet or sticker for available, maybe like yellow for, maybe not, and then red for not at all available. This can also be helpful when employees are wearing headphones. So instead of trying to shout over a headphone that's trying to block noise, a visual cue can be really helpful with this. Make sure when you make trainings that they are also clear, and especially with signs. There's an example to follow. So there's a 7-step process that is the steps for shutdown and lockout tagout. Um, and so I tried to make like an example of what a sign would look like, but as you can see with the way it's described, especially through MIOSHA, it's too long to be on one singular page. If you're trying to make a sign for that, it would not really be very clear what those steps are. So with Todd's help, I was able to make a sign that's a little more concise, and has all 7 steps with some description for each. Um, so the last side was, to put it simply, it was just too complicated to put on one piece of paper. I also added that document showing the alternative, more concise directions for each step in the Google folder that I shared with everybody. And there's another note, also, each machine should have its own machine specific directions. So instead of just having a general notice by each one that's showing the steps for lockout, tagout, or, shutting down a equipment, it should be specific to that machine and have specific directions. So an emergency buddy is a term I came up with for one of the last presentations we had, but I thought it might be a good idea to, even if it's called something else, having somebody that's around, a trustworthy coworker for a neurodivergent employee in times of an emergency, or even during a safety procedure such as this, um, in case they get overwhelmed. That way they can have somebody around if their manager isn't always around. Um, Proprioception is another important topic. It's the awareness of one's body. So always consider an employee's proprioception as something, as some neurotypes do not perceive themselves well, especially if they're hyper focused. They may work themselves too hard physically without even realizing until after a task is done. So maybe when working with machinery, you may want to offer little breaks here and there. Um, and also just being proactive with reminders of self. Todd does this a lot whenever I'm in the office. I'm not in the office often, but sometimes I'm moving boxes around, and I've had a lot of back injuries in the past, and he'll, kind of just give a gentle reminder like, hey, you probably shouldn't be moving that big heavy box of like 400 conference swag bags around, So Todd reminds me a lot, and I appreciate him for that. Time buffered schedules. This is also an important topic because it allows for processing and reflection for all neurotypes. So consider having breaks during long trainings or breaks in video trainings. A 15-minute break for every 1 to 2 hours in person or live video. So be sure to break up with activities and discussions. So, for example, for a live day training, may look like, maybe like an hour and a half with a 15-minute break, another hour and 15 minutes with another training bit, maybe having some breakouts and activities with those trainings, having lunch, and then ending the day with a training, maybe with two breakout sessions. Um, if you wanted to take that same roughly 6 hour training and record it, or make it on demand or accessible at any time, that may look like 15 to 30-minute videos with questions in between. Understandably, that is a lot of editing, so breaking it up into hour-long videos is good if there is a way for learners to pause and return to the content. Memory capacity is definitely something to consider. Even after all you can do to make a training, you have to consider everyone's memory capacity because it is estimated 50% of what is learned is immediately forgotten. Spaced learning also helps retain what is taught. So you may have a requirement for people to learn safety information maybe once a year on a certain topic. But with spaced learning, this is something that is really important because on this graph being shown before us, it shows retention on the y-axis going up and down and the time passing from left to right. And as time goes on the right of the scale, time is passing. So we have one curve that shows that there's one uh either training or a one opportunity to actually retrieve or review that information. And along this x-axis, this forgetting curve is very severe and shows that whatever this training was or this part for active review, the person is just forgetting everything. However, with more intermittent spaces for active retrieval or review, um, it shows that the forgetting curve that it's called starts to flatten out. So, in other words, the more times that you're letting your employees not only actively retrieve, but also review that information, they start to forget less and that there's better long-term retention. There's also evidence showing that information retention for all neurotypes is also affected by location. So employees are more likely to remember information in the spot they learned that information. So procedures should be taught in the spot they will be used. So now that it's the end of my section, how can you improve your safety trainings? We created a checklist for you to discuss with your employees and apply to your own trainings. Did anyone have anything to say before I move on to the next section? So, there is a blank version of this. Um, so this says, does your training meet the needs of all employees? Fill this chart to determine if you meet the needs of your staff. Ideally, it's the best to fill this out with employees you wish to assist the most. So there's a training and question spot to fill out and a date. Um, And I'm just going to go over a couple of these. Let's say it's for safety training on bloodborne pathogens. Can employees freely ask questions? And the first column is the type of consideration, and that's was the example of can employees freely ask questions. The second column is what is done during the current training, and then the third column is any improvements that could be made. So when it comes to freely asking questions during the current training, employees were able to ask their managers via email after the training. But in the improvement column, they said, we plan on making the training more interactive so employees can freely ask questions and that the trainer is respectful of all questions. Um, the second row is universal design. Are there multiple formats of the same training, in person versus virtual, handouts, recordings? So for the current training, a manager would fill out, we have an online training that is given live every year. We also have an in-person training given upon hire. And then in the improvement section, it says we will create some step-by-step documents and record the next virtual presentation to give employees the option to watch a recording. So you can look at this yourself. Like I said, I'm going to stop the recording or stop the sharing so that we can get back to the PowerPoint. So now I want to open it up to everybody here. Is there anything specific from this training that would be beneficial for your safety trainings? And feel free to unmute yourself as well. Alrighty. Well, I'm going to move on and I don't want to take up too much of your time. So, Todd, I'll hand it over to you for this slide.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it. In summary, as we close this afternoon, going back to the compliance portion of the content, we want to make sure that as employers, you know the requirements of the MIOSHA standard, that Consultation Education and Training Division resources can be used to assist with that program and those procedures. And it's also important to know all the responsibilities that are outlined in the standard, both from the employer's perspective and as an employee. Both parties bear a responsibility for compliance with this rule. It's very important to consider all sources of energy. Electricity is certainly the most prevalent, but we need to make sure that all sources are considered. And also remember the circumstances under which lockout is required and when those two categories, if a guard ever needs to be removed or bypassed, and if an employee ever needs to put their body part in harm's way or where equipment is moving. That's when it's important to never ever, especially important to never ever take any shortcuts. And equipment-specific lockout procedures need to be developed, implemented, training is conducted accordingly, and all those procedures need to be reviewed. So having a generic policy that's consistent with the MIOSHA standard is not enough. We need to make sure that each piece of equipment that has a power source also has a lockout procedure for employee protection. It's also important to remember all the considerations and accommodations that Katie outlined to support a diverse workforce, most particularly a neurodiverse workforce, and that when creating trainings, we need to remember to consider the needs of all employees to improve retention. That's what powers not only compliance with the regulation, but powers prevention. And that returns to sort of the key concept in all these trainings is that these are designed to keep folks safe before an accident or injury occurs. We thank you for making time for the presentation today. Do stay safe and stay healthy. We have some of our citations and resources included on the concluding slides here, but most of these documents are made available to you through the resources that Katie has provided linked in the chat box and that were distributed. If you can advance through, there we go. Thanks, Katie. The standard itself, there's a compliance guide that's enormously helpful that's distributed by MIOSHA. There's also a fact sheet that nicely supplements those resources that comes from federal OSHA. And then Katie has a rich resource guide here with lots of good information on developing more inclusive training and considerations, particularly for neuro-inclusivity. And that quick start packet that's referenced at the bottom is also included in some of the resources that are available to you. If you would like a follow-up training or if you have other training needs, the guidelines of this grant do support some additional connection. So reach out to us if you have any questions or are interested in scheduling a training. The best way to do that is by contacting Katie at the email address on the slide. Let us know the date, time, and length of training you're considering and what the content is that you're looking for and approximately how many employees. And we'd be happy to support you in any way we can. There is one question, Katie, while folks are still together about the slideshow that folks can use. Are the slides are included in the resources that are? Yep. So the slides are included. That's not copyrighted material. You're welcome to carve those up in any way that would be useful to you, depending on the training that you'd like to provide. Particularly if you're looking for content in the compliance area, feel free to make use of those. And then perhaps use the content that are in the slides that Katie presented to guide the way in which you present that material. Great question.
And then also too, I'm going to stop the recording now.